Go.
All right, welcome and thank you for joining us with this afternoon's webinar. My name is Cathy Jensen and I'm going to talk to you today about functional behavior assessment for students with brain injury. So I'm just going to dive in. I probably have more to talk about today than I have time for, but I will be watching as we go along as people are logging in and listening along. I hope that you will participate by asking me any questions and chiming in with any thoughts you have about some of the things I share. Watching some of the people that are logging in, I know some of you, and I know you all have a lot of really great information about these topics. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. So let's dive in. We have about an hour today. Let's see if I can get my screen to cooperate. All right, so this is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to do a very quick overview of functional behavior assessment. I'm not going to dive into it very deeply. I just want to make sure that we kind of calibrate some of the terms that I'm going to be using so that we're all thinking about the same process together. And then I'll also do a very quick calibration of what do I mean when I talk about brain injury. So that will be very brief. And then we're going to dive into talking about data. That's not usually the order that we go in when we talk about functional assessment and behavior planning, but I'll talk later about why I put data first typically. And that's really going to be a big focus of what we're going to talk about today, because I find that data is an area that can be a barrier sometimes for teams. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the functional behavior assessment team and what that process can look like for students with brain injury. And then I'm going to go through some of the sections of the functional behavior assessment and talk about some considerations that the team might have that are specific and unique to students with brain injury. So that's the overview of how we'll spend our time for this hour. So I always think it's helpful to talk a little bit about myself so you understand my perspective and where I'm coming from. I wear a lot of different hats. I've got this cute little image to represent that. I am a licensed school psychologist. I believe I'm in year 22. It's been a while. I'm also a behavior specialist. I've done a lot of work with behavior consultation. I spent several years as a school psychologist for behavior programs, and we certainly had a lot of students in those programs that I would describe as neurologically complex. So students who had experienced trauma, abuse. Many of them probably had some kind of brain injury in their past, either as a result of abuse or accident or all sorts of different things going on, plus multiple alphabet soup diagnoses. And then I've also worked as a behavior specialist consultant for a district-wide program. I'm currently a special education director at Northwest Regional ESD. I stepped into the director role just this year. Prior to that, I coordinated our autism team and our school psychology team for about 4 years. As part of that role, and I am continuing in this role, TBI liaison for Region 8. And most of you may know what that is, but that simply means I'm the TBI liaison for Clatsop, Columbia, Tillamook, and Washington counties, which is where Region 8 resides in the state of Oregon. We have 8 regions. So part of my role as the TBI liaison is to help connect people in the region to training, provide consultation, support members of our TBI consulting team, etc. And being the liaison has been one of the funnest things about my job. I get to do a lot of really fun things that I really enjoy connecting with people who are passionate about supporting individuals with brain injury. People have a lot of interest in this for lots of reasons. Many of them have a personal connection, either because they themselves have experienced a brain injury or somebody important in their life has experienced a brain injury. And I always like to talk about my own personal connection. I grew up with a grandfather who had had a traumatic brain injury before I was born. He had been in a car accident in the 50s and was significantly altered. He had been in a coma after the accident. They didn't think that he was going to ever wake up from a coma, and then when he woke up from a coma, they didn't know if he was going to ever be able to speak or write or read again, and he did recover a lot of those skills, but was significantly altered. And throughout his life, continue to have short-term memory difficulties and executive function difficulties. And my grandmother and other members of the family described significant differences in his personality from who he had been before the brain injury. So that was part of my life growing up. He was somebody I was very close to, and when I think about the impact of brain injury, he certainly is often in my mind. So that's a little bit of an overview about who I am and where I'm coming from. So first I want to talk about functional behavior assessment, just to talk about some definitions and make sure that we are all on the same page. I'm not going to go into in depth, but I do recommend that if you are interested in more about functional behavior assessment, I suspect many of you logging on already know quite a bit, but one of many great resources is basicfba.com, and that was developed by Portland State. So it's an online training course that you can take on functional behavior assessment, and there are lots of resources there that's free. So some definitions. A functional assessment is a strategy for identifying the purpose or function of an individual's behavior. And I think about it as a problem-solving method. So anytime that I am struggling to understand what is going on for a student, or we've tried lots of different things to support a student and we're not sure what the next step should be, a functional assessment is a really great structured way to do some problem solving with the team. The team together will develop a plan to modify variables that maintain problem behaviors. In other words, we're trying to figure out what keeps those problem behaviors occurring, what maintains them, what reinforces them. And then the plan will include strategies to teach replacement behaviors using positive behavioral interventions. So that teaching of replacement behaviors is a really key component of a functional behavior assessment. So the steps. First, we're going to collect some data so that we can understand these 5 components: the presets, setting events, antecedents, behaviors, and functions. Together as a team, we'll analyze the data. We'll develop a hypothesis. So essentially, we're going to create a statement about why the student is behaving the way that they are, what the function of that behavior is. From that hypothesis, we'll develop and implement a behavior plan, and then we monitor the plan. So this is the basic cycle that most of you are familiar with. Some really key important components to any functional behavior assessment, I believe. One of them is that it should be team-based and collaborative. As a school psychologist, I have collected data, analyzed it, written a functional behavior assessment by myself, and created a document that looks very similar to an evaluation report. But when I do that, I find that, and then of course I present that to the team. When I do it that way, I find that the team sometimes struggles to have consensus about what is going on for that student. So when I do it by myself and present it to the team, it's not as powerful as if we do it and create it as together. If we all give input into the functional assessment, and then at the end of it, we all together understand something about the student that we didn't know before. So that's really important to me. I talked about here in one of the bullet points, the support team develops a shared hypothesis. So the support team being the people who are wrapping around the student to support them in all aspects of their education. And often, even though we are focusing on the students' school experiences, usually when we're completing functional assessments at school, we often extend that into the home. And it should guide the behavior plan. Somebody once asked me, what is a key component of a good quality functional assessment? And I said, it should be that it resulted in a behavior support plan that was actually effective in supporting the student, and the student had positive outcomes. So that could be a plan, a functional assessment that's very short or long, whatever is needed for that particular individual. All right, so that was just a quick overview of functional behavior assessment. This next slide, I'm talking about what do we mean by brain injury. I just want to talk about some quick terms. We often talk about acquired brain injury versus traumatic brain injury. So acquired brain injury can be things like anoxia. So the individual experienced lack of oxygen, maybe an infection that impacted the brain, a stroke, tumor, metabolic disorders, and things like that. And then traumatic brain injury is caused by an external force. And the reason it's important to make those distinctions, there isn't a big difference in terms of the effects on the individual, but in the state of Oregon, only traumatic brain injury is eligible under IDEA. So individuals with acquired brain injury would not be eligible for special ed services based on that brain injury alone. They might be eligible under other categories besides traumatic brain injury. We sometimes catch those kids under intellectual delay or learning disabilities, things like that, but they're not usually eligible under they're not eligible under traumatic brain injury. So it's an important thing to be aware of. So the traumatic brain injury is caused by an external physical force, and that can be an open or closed brain injury. All right. So now I'm going to dive into data. I mentioned earlier that I'm going to talk about why I talk about data first. One of the reasons is that data is sometimes the last thing that we think of. So we do all the work of collecting some information about the student, analyzing it, completing the functional assessment, completing the behavior plan, and then we need to monitor how effective the plan is, and that's sometimes when we create the system for monitoring the student's progress. And that's hard to do after you've done all of that other work and you're really diving into the important role of really supporting that student. So I always recommend thinking about what kind of data is effective to take first, and getting some systems in place that you have the chance to use and practice regularly. So when you complete all the steps and you have your behavior support plan, you're ready to go with progress monitoring. Another important component is that data collection really needs to be efficient to be effective. For those of us working in schools, there's a lot going on during the day, and we need data systems that are really quick and easy and give us really good information. If the data system is really complex and challenging to complete, we're just not going to be able to do it effectively, and it's not going to be useful. And finally, I think that putting data into the hands of the people who are supporting the student is very empowering and reinforcing. The work we do can be really difficult and challenging. It really pushes us to our limits sometimes, and on a day-to-day basis, sometimes it's hard to see whether we're making an impact on the student. But if we're collecting data and analyzing that on a regular basis, we can see the baby steps that kiddos are making towards positive progress, and it's exciting to see. So I always think it's fun to be able to put data in front of people who are working with students and show them visually how that kiddo is doing. So that's why I'm going to talk about data a little bit before I dive into the FBA piece. So another thing I'd like to talk about is who the data is for. It's for the support team, right? And that's going to be the teachers, could be the paraprofessionals. Those are a really key important component because they are often really close to the student. And so it's great for them to be able to see if the student is making progress. Of course, the parents as well, it's very helpful for them. It can be for community support services. So if the student is accessing services outside of the school, being able to share their progress data from school can be really helpful for those people to determine if their services are making an impact. And then, of course, sometimes data is great for students too. A lot of kids like to see how they're doing when they're making positive progress. So, so today I'm going to talk about 3 types of data. One, I'm going to talk about recovery data. What I mean by that is for students who have had a concussion and are still recovering, or even a traumatic brain injury, and they're in the recovery process. And for those of you who've worked with an individual with a fairly recent brain injury, you know that things are often changing quickly for that individual. And so I'm going to just show you a couple of strategies for monitoring symptoms for that student as they're hopefully changing and healing. And then I'm going to go over some of my favorite tools for collecting data for the functional assessment. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some strategies for progress monitoring. So here is a chart that I borrowed from our partners at the Center for Brain Injury Research and Training on some concussion symptoms. And one really easy way to collect some data around recovery is to take something like this, put it in the hands of a teacher or a parent, or even the individual, have them circle the symptoms that the student is experiencing. And then do a few probes. Maybe have them do that once a day. You know, is the student continuing to experience dizziness? Are we concerned about confusion? Maybe make a couple of notes about that. So it's not a fancy data sheet. It's just a really simple list. Have them date it, have them circle some things, and then collect the data over time. And then you can, you know, if they're collecting it for you, maybe they're at a school site that you're checking in on. Maybe they put that into a notebook, and you can quickly flip through, you know, maybe 5 days of data and see if you can see some progress. So that's a very quick and dirty method. Here's a really nice checklist that I just took a quick screenshot of what this looks like. I have the link to that here, the post-concussion symptoms checklist from siebert.org if you want to pull up the full one. You know, it's intended to be used as just a quick probe to determine what symptoms the individual is experiencing and how severe, but you could take this, highlight the symptoms that are of most concern for that individual, and then use that to continue to monitor the student's progress. So if you had an individual who was really struggling with headaches, balance problems, dizziness, and the first probe, they were rated as severe, have them fill it out a week later, and then see if there are any changes. So again, that's a very, very simple way of collecting recovery data. I also included the siebert.org link to the protocol for return to academics, because you would probably use these together to monitor whether or not the student is ready to return to their regular academic schedule. If a student, you know, you want to kind of gradually return them following a brain injury to their academic program. You don't want to just drop them back in while they're experiencing symptoms. And so you might maybe, for example, you've decided, the team, or excuse me, the support team has decided to start the students 1 hour a day, and then after a few days increase to a half day. If at the start of that student was, you know, you felt like the reason for increasing to a half day was that the student was experiencing pretty minimal symptoms, but then you increased it and then the symptoms return, that's a good indicator that maybe you need to put some things in place or maybe return to a lighter schedule. So it's a really nice tool for monitoring how the student's recovering and how they're responding to their current academic schedule. So, all right, I'm just going to take a quick peek to see if there are any questions. Let's see. I think I'm seeing part. We'll ask Cathy to send them to likes, and we will send them to you all. I'm guessing this is probably data forms or something like that. So this is another tool that I like to use for, excuse me, just to preface the next section, I'm going to talk about my favorite tools for collecting data for the functional behavior assessment. And this is one of my favorite tools. The link here on this slide actually links to a packet from Chris Borgmeyer at Portland State. I'm not sure what the date on this is. He's had it out and available for free for years, and it's been my template for conducting functional behavior assessments for a very, very long time. It's very involved, and essentially there's lots of really great ways of collecting data, and it really guides you through the functional behavior assessment process. But what I did is I took from that the schedule or routines analysis, simplified it a little bit for myself, and then it became one of my favorite tools. And so this is a snapshot of what this looks like. And what you would do for a student is that you would fill in the time, the activity throughout the day, the schedule. So starting from the time the student gets off the bus to the time that they get back on the bus and arrive home, or you might even start, if you're working with a parent, start with their morning routine. Fill in the whole day, rate the likelihood of problem behaviors, and then make notes about those behaviors. I'm going to show you an example in just a second of what that can look like. You know, it can be very simple or it can be very detailed. What I really enjoy about this is that once I've collected this information, it gives me a really nice visual of what the student's day looks like and where the priorities need to be. So often when a student is struggling and a parent or a teacher or instructional assistant is talking to me about their concerns, they may feel overwhelmed because the behavior is really severe and they're struggling to support the student. Once we do this form together, and the information can be gathered by interview, by observations, there are all sorts of different great resources for gathering that information. It really starts to put things in perspective. You get to see where the student has really strong areas, where they're doing really well and being successful in the day, and then where they're really struggling. And again, the way that I usually collect this data, my favorite way to do it is to sit down with somebody who really knows the student's schedule well and interview them and fill it out together, or multiple people. And sometimes, sometimes there are some people who might know the morning schedule, some people might know the afternoon schedule. Parents often have a piece, they know what's happening before the student gets on the bus, and they usually know what that bus ride looks like. So there's lots of great ways that you can gather that information. So let's see if I can get my slide to advance here. Oops. So here's a sample of what this can look like. So this is a student who starts their day with breakfast in the cafeteria, sometimes escalates if he doesn't have the right breakfast items that are his favorite. Usually does well when he transitions to class, but once he's in class and has completed the morning routine, what I discovered in the interview with the teacher is that sometimes she chooses to have the students go to carpet instead of being at their desks. And when that transition happens, sometimes he struggles when he's at carpet area. And I had highlighted that because I wanted to make sure that I knew that that was a potential antecedent. But then the transition to specials usually goes well because he really enjoys specials and there's some of his preferred activities there. Usually specials goes well, however, when it goes badly, it goes really badly. So that's why there's a 1 or a 5 under specials. And specifically a trigger for this student is that if a peer comments on his ability to complete an activity or makes some comment that he perceives as negative, he really escalates. And this is just a snapshot of part of it. This analysis went through the whole day, but you can see it just gives you a really nice visual of where the strengths are and where the potential triggers are. So once I gather this information, I take lots and lots of notes. I look for where are the student's strengths, where is the student doing well during the day. I also look for positive connections with adults and students. So I'm looking through there and looking for any notes about maybe the teacher commented, yeah, he just really likes his reading group because he's really connected with the teacher who leads that group. Or he really enjoys lunch, even though it's hard for him in that busy environment. He has some light sensitivity, but his best friend is in there. And if there aren't positive connections with adults and students, if that is a theme that I'm seeing throughout the day, I make sure that I talk with the team about how we can add that back in. Because if the student is struggling with relationships across the board, that's going to be a rough day. It's really hard to put together a positive plan unless the student has people in their life during the school day that they feel are really supporting them. And then less preferred activities, that's really helpful. You can build some contingencies around preferred activities. So if a student really enjoys a science activity, you might be able to build in that right before that activity, the student does something that maybe he doesn't enjoy as much, like maybe he needs to complete a writing task so that he can get to go to the assigned activity. And then also gives you an idea of, okay, what is already in the student's environment that's reinforcing. So that's another red flag. If I go through the day and there just doesn't seem to be anything that's just fun that the student enjoys doing, they don't like any of the activities that are offered, they don't enjoy going to recess, they don't enjoy specials, and we need to make sure that we build some things in the day that are fun, because it's pretty rough to go through a whole day and not have some fun things to look forward to. I look for skill placement, so I'll ask some of the questions. Could part of the challenge of math time be that the student's not receiving enough support, or it's not the right level for them? And of course, you'll see possible antecedents sprinkle through, and I'll usually go back through and highlight them after I've completed the green gains analysis. And then finally, this tells us how to prioritize the behavior support plan. You look for those 5s where there's a very high likelihood of problem behavior, and that's probably what we're going to focus on. This is another form that I really like to use, and there's a similar version of it in that packet that I linked to by Chris Borgmeyer. It's called an escalation worksheet. So for students who have crisis behavior, so they're escalating to the point where they are at risk of harming themselves or others, or their behaviors are so significantly disruptive to the environment that they're in that it's really difficult for them to be in that setting. It's helpful to fill something else like this so I can kind of see what that pattern looks like. And this also really helps with building a behavior support plan, because I actually write my behavior plan so they look similar to this. I just enlarge all these boxes, and then I have strategies for each stage of escalation. I always start with positive student skills. So when the student is doing well, what are their strengths? What are their skills? I identify those. Early signs of stress, I like to really probe for that, because often people will tell me the student goes from 0 to 60. That can be the case. Some of the students that I've worked with do escalate very, very quickly. But sometimes what's happening is that we are just so busy. We have a lot going on. We're not always assigned to just one student and maybe teaching a group, or you might be working with a teacher teaching a class. And it's really hard to monitor those early signs of stress. And so using this worksheet, we can help the team come together and identify what those are and document them so that everybody's a little bit more able to watch them. So early signs of stress for a kiddo might be very subtle. I always tell people, as the behavior specialist coming in to observe, I might not be able to tell, but sometimes people tell me things like they notice maybe a little bit of puffiness around the eyes, or he's blinking a little bit more because the light is bothering him, or tapping his pencil, or things like that. And then we've got early signs of escalation. So it's not just that the student's stressed, but now they're starting to escalate. They're starting to have some work refusals or other behaviors that are concerning. That may not be significantly problematic, but it just tells us that something's not working for that kid. And then later signs, what tells us that that student's getting close to that point of no return. And what does crisis look like for this kiddo? Is it injuring themselves? Are they running away? Are they destroying materials, things like that. And then the last thing I do is find out what de-escalation looks like. It's a really important component. We want to make sure that we're able to support the students safely, either to prevent reaching crisis, or if they do reach crisis, we can keep them safe. But how do we help them calm down and return to their regular activities? And alongside each of these, I take notes about what the staff response is. There's no judgment here. It's just what did you try at each stage? What works and what doesn't work? Let's capture that as part of the data that goes into developing a functional behavior assessment. All right. So other really important sources of data are, of course, file reviews, observations, and interviews. You can interview the student, the teacher. There are a lot of interview forms. I've been doing this a long time, so I usually just use this in the escalation worksheet as my template for interviews, but there are some other interview forms in the lab. If you do a quick search or go to the Chris Borgmeyer work link or the Basic FBA link, you'll find some examples. I have a picture here of Sniffleupagus. If you remember, Sniffleupagus, I believe, is a real friend of Big Bird, but the running gag on Sesame Street was that nobody else ever saw him, so they didn't believe that he existed. I often felt like that when I was coming in to do an observation, and inevitably that's the day that the student's having the best day ever, and whatever behaviors that were of concern, I don't get to see it on that day. And then, of course, I always tell people that, yes, we believe you. It's just, there's an observer effect sometimes. As sneaky as I try to be, a lot of times kids know that I'm there to watch them. Or, just the luck of the dice, I'm trying to pop in and get a snapshot of a student who's experiencing, a range of challenges throughout the day. They're experiencing success at times, and they're struggling at other times. And maybe I rolled the dice that day, and I just didn't get to see the behaviors that were of concern. But the observation is just one piece of the picture. I'm collecting lots of information from the support team. So, all right, so that's data around the functional assessment. I'm going to circle back and talk about how you take that and start building the functional assessment. But now I'm going to switch to progress monitoring. There are lots of different tools for progress monitoring, but I'm just going to talk about 3 of my favorites today. One will be daily data that is really easy for people to take for a student. I have a little bit more in-depth monitoring data sheet that I like to use for students that are experiencing more complex highs and lows throughout the day due to health concerns. Maybe they're in recovery from a brain injury, maybe they're experiencing depression and anxiety, and I'm going to capture some of that. And then I have a form that I use for students who have crisis behaviors, and I just want to document those incidents. So, so this form is very simple. We've got 3 categories. We've got green, yellow, red. You can see that we have one form for each day. We would have this set up at regular intervals throughout the day. This form, I set it up with half-hour increments just so that we can capture how the student is doing every half hour. Super easy. The adult will just check how the student is doing in each category. And this is the key. So green is the student is doing well. And the team is going to decide what that means for the student. What does that look like for the kiddo? What does a really good day for this student look like? Yellow is the student struggling, and red the student's in crisis. So here's it broken down. This is how it might look for an individual student. And I think it's really important for the support team to decide what each of these mean so that everybody who's taking data really understands that. So green could be the student has safe hands and feet, they participate in all their activities. Yellow, maybe the student is tired and irritable, right? We're seeing maybe some symptoms impact the student. Might have inappropriate tone of voice, refusing to work, etc. And then red is those crisis behaviors. So that's a really easy way to take data. I'm just going to flip back here. You can see just a quick check mark. If somebody is really busy during the day, you know, they're often the person taking the data is also working with the student. You know, if they have a timer on their phone, or if they have a Fitbit or a smartwatch or something like that, you know, they can just quickly do a check mark. If they miss one interval, it's usually pretty easy to remember. You know, was the student mostly green? Were they mostly yellow? If they have any crisis behaviors, we would mark that as red, and then scribble that sentence. So that's one easy way to take data. This one is very similar idea, it's just a little bit more complex. So in this one, we would define what each of these mean. I'm going to cover that in a second. And I think on the next slide, I have, oops, I'm just going to flip down here. So I have an example of what this might look like. What's nice about this is if you are a consultant checking in, or maybe if you are somebody working with a student for part of their day, you can pick up this data sheet at a glance. And I just want to make a note, this is not something that the student sees. This would be on a clipboard or somewhere that is inconspicuous. You can at a glance see the pattern of how the student's day, so how the student's day is going. So if I were coming in at 11 to help, maybe it's time for lunch, and I want to know how the student's doing, I don't have to say a word to whoever was supporting the student before me. I pick this up and I can see a 0 that this is rough. Okay, so we probably need to spend some time in the sensory room. And then at the end of the day, you can really see the pattern. It makes its own kind of little graph. And so I'm going to back up with this one. The instructions are that you'll circle one number that best describes the student's behavior, and you would circle the lowest number. So if you know, you're wondering, is it a 2 or a 3, then you circle the lowest. And I always make sure that these instructions are on every data sheet. And then similar to the green, yellow, red one, we would determine what these numbers mean with the team. You know, 3 would be alert and engaged. So students doing really well. 2, maybe they need a little bit more support, but they're pretty much able to participate in their educational program. 1 would be that they're really struggling to participate, and maybe they're disruptive or they're not able to be in the main environment. And then 0 would be crisis behaviors. I've also modified this to have negative numbers to represent students who are struggling with, you know, fatigue. So maybe a student is sleeping, or extremely lethargic, or exhibiting depression and things like that. So it just kind of gives you just some really good information about how the student's doing. You could use this for recovery data. I often will collect this kind of data when maybe the student has outside care providers maybe a physician is monitoring them, and I want to be able to provide information to them. So this is what it looks like. There's a small comment box for the adult to write some notes. I make those comments pretty small because I don't want people to think that they have to write really complex notes throughout the day. Just looking at this, you can see at a glance, you don't even know who this student is, but you probably already have a pretty good idea of what's happening for this kiddo just from reading these quick little notes and seeing the ratings. All right, so one more data sheet. I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the time, make sure I'm on track here. So if the student has crisis behaviors, I set up a data sheet like this. This is just one row of probably 5 rows that might be on one page. And so if the student has an incident, you know, as soon as the staff person has a chance, they just put the date. What was the activity? You know, was it math? Was it recess, PE, whatever? Who was with the student? The setting, antecedent. What was the student's affect? And then specifically what the behavior was, and then a rating of intensity. And you can see this is like this is ABC data, and the student behavior consequences gives you a little bit of that information. If people are collecting this information, again, if you're the one that's coming in doing some checks and progress monitoring, you know, if they're collecting that into a notebook or something, it's very easy to kind of flip through and see what some patterns are. You can see, you know, maybe 4 out of 5 times that the student had a crisis incident, it occurred, you know, between 10 and 11 in the morning, then we're going to really zero in on what's happening there. And you can share that, you know, with the team and reflect on it together. And people really have a great tool to make to work towards developing a hypothesis about what's going on. All right, so I'm just going to check some questions. All right, let's see where we are. Oops, okay, there we go. So some troubleshooting data collection. I always, if I create a data sheet or I use one that exists, I always try it out first before I ask other people to take the data, because sometimes what I think would be a great idea to use just isn't as efficient or effective as I'd like it to be, or maybe it didn't give me the data I wanted. So I will usually sit and take the data for a little bit. I really encourage people to take data throughout the day. People forget, usually for one of 2 reasons. Either the student was doing really well and they were really engaged with the student and excited and they just didn't get around to taking the data, or the student's really struggling. And so there are blank sheets on the data. But if we don't have a complete record of the whole day, then the data isn't as valid, because it makes it difficult to analyze later. You know, we just don't know what happened. You know, I encourage people to use timers or other reminders. It is really hard to remember throughout the day. Sharing the results with the team is really reinforcing to people expect about that. And I try to put the, you know, analyze the data, try to make it into a graph or something visual so people can see that positive trend line. Or, you know, if the student isn't, you know, that doing well, we can really address that quickly. Sometimes the person who is supporting the student literally cannot take their eyes off the student to record the data, so I make sure to factor that in. Or maybe they only have just a quick second to make a check mark. They maybe don't have time to read through a complex data sheet. Other troubleshooting tips. Visually, I like to keep things to one page. I don't want people to have to flip through things. I want to make sure that the data sheet is easy to understand, so anybody that comes in to support the student can at a glance figure out how to do it. And I talked about the importance of it being efficient. It's really helpful, whatever rubric you're using or whatever criteria you're using on for rating, it should be right there so that everybody can read it and have really good inter-rater reliability. And I even go in and practice, because even though it makes it clear to me, everybody has a slightly different perspective. And so some quick conversations and notes to help everybody get on the same page can make a really big difference. And then I always encourage people to think about when they're using a data system to progress monitor, to focus on accuracy versus precision. And in this context, what I mean is, what is the level of measurement? Sometimes people, I think, try to capture too much throughout the day when they're collecting data, and it gets so complicated that it's very difficult to be consistent. And then the data is really kind of adds up to a lot of noise, and it's hard to make sense of it. So here I've got two different rulers. They're not to scale, but we're pretending that these are both inch rulers. So the ruler on the left is, we've got two examples. One is measuring to the inch versus the half inch, and then the ruler on the right is measuring to the 1/16 of an inch. Both are still accurate at measuring what an inch is. It's just that the one on the right is more precise. We want to focus on sometimes accuracy over precision with data. We might not be capturing every little detail of everything that happens throughout the day, but we're being really consistent about how we're collecting the data. I always recommend setting up time increments of no fewer than 15 minutes and usually no more than 45 minutes. 30 minutes is usually about the sweet spot. I always tell this story. I worked with one team that decided to do 5-minute increments, and they had a really great rationale for why they wanted to do that. They were trying to be very, very precise in the data that they were collecting because they were trying to measure very small improvements in the student growth. And I told them, I don't know if this is a good idea, but they were determined and they did it, and they did a great job, and they had little timers that they used. But that is really difficult to do. 15 to 20 minutes is hard. If you can get to 30 minutes, you've really got a nice sample of what's happening for the student. And I try to encourage them to use equal time increments. When we're working with students, we like to set up data that aligns with their school schedule, because that's so much easier. When the student comes to a natural stopping point with an activity, it's easier to collect the data. And if you can line up the times more or less with the student schedule, it's certainly easier for everybody. But what sometimes happens is that the time increments are so different that you're not really getting a good understanding of what's happening. So for example, sometimes people set up a data sheet. So maybe the first 50 minutes is your arrival routine, and then the next section is reading, but reading is 90 minutes. So a lot happens in that 90 minutes. It's really better if we make sure that we break that up into equal time increments. And then I make sure to include the entire day, because I want to capture what's going well for the student in the data. All right. So that's my spiel about data, and now I'm going to dive into, I've got about just over 15 minutes. I'm going to talk about the FBA team, and I'm going to go through some parts of the FBA and some considerations for students with brain injury. When we're thinking about the school team for students with brain injury, one of the things that teams often express to me is that they don't feel like they quite have the competencies they need to support a student with complex needs. But typically, as schools have a whole range of really skilled people supporting students, and this is not an exhaustive list of everybody who might be part of a student's team. And when you look at this, you can see that there is a wide range of skills that all of these people are bringing to the table. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that all of these people are going to come together to create an FBA together, but when you're thinking about who can be part of the team, this is, I hope that this will give people some ideas. The students, not all students should be part of the meeting, but they can certainly give input. The family as well have a really important role and lots of really good insight and are great contributors to the FBA process. Of course, teachers, paraprofessionals, learning specialists are important. We have all the specialists. Nurses are really important part of for a student with a brain injury. Often they bring that medical perspective and understanding that is super valuable. Got special educators, any support, community liaisons, if we can bring them to the table or interview them. And then other support people that we don't always think of. Bus drivers often have amazing insight. They often have really strong relationships with students, people in the front office, lunchroom staff, custodial support people. All of those people can be contributors to the FBA, at least through the interview process. So I just want to let you think about that. So now I'm going to dive into completing the FBA form and beginning to build the functional assessment. This is a very simple FBA form that I developed, and I'm going to talk about an example FBA for my cat, just because it's kind of fun. But this is very simple. There are more complex FBA forms that people can use, but I'd like to start with this one. I always start with strengths and interests, because when I'm building a behavior plan, I want to know what are the strengths that I can capitalize on, and what are some interests that might be that lead us to understanding. We just know that might be reinforcing that we can use. Presets are, I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but those are things that essentially are part of the student every day. So it could be often for students that we're doing the FBA, it's a disability. Today we're talking about students with a brain injury. That would be a significant preset. And then we have these 4 categories: setting events. Those are events that happen outside the immediate routine that make the problem behavior more likely or worse. I'm going to give some examples of that. Most people know what setting events are for students, even if they don't use that term. They're very aware of that. Antecedents are what trigger or predict the behavior. And then we've got a box for the problem behavior. And the consequences or function, that's what happens after the behavior that makes it more likely to occur again. And for this, for these purposes, when we talk about consequences, we don't necessarily mean punishment. We just mean what happens as a result of the behavior, what happens next. So presets, so effects of brain injury that the team might want to consider. We have cognitive effects. Students might have motor effects, communication, regulatory disturbances. Dramatic epilepsy might be a part of the picture for some students, and then emotional trauma. So I'm going to delve into these a little bit more, and of course you will have this PowerPoint as reference. So cognitive effects, you know, sometimes we are working with students transitioning to school from having been in a coma, and they're recovering from that. That has some pretty significant impacts on students, even, you know, as they are recovering. They might experience confusion, amnesia, difficult orientation difficulties understanding abstract concepts. It impacts learning. You often see inconsistent performance with students, difficulties with retention of skills, etc. I have in red at the bottom here executive function difficulties, because even for students who have experienced significant recovery in other cognitive areas may continue to experience executive function difficulties. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Motor effects, so sometimes students may experience paralysis. So you want to think, or weakness, which can impact their ability to navigate the environment, can impact their fatigue. Balance, endurance is a big one for individuals with brain injury. Often they just struggle with having the same stamina that they used to have. So I won't go over all of these in detail. Communication and language, of course, the student might have expressive receptive difficulties, you know, the language difficulties might impact their reading comprehension or writing skills, things like that. They may have difficulty, slow or hesitant speech, their vocabulary. They might have difficulty accessing vocabulary that they used to have, etc. Regulatory disturbances are often common. So we see kids who have difficulties with fatigue, stamina, changes in sleep patterns or eating habits, dizziness, headaches. Sensory sensitivity is very common. So maybe the lights are too bright, or kids are more sensitive to noise, or sensitive to, you know, maybe the texture of their clothing and things like that. Epilepsy, so sometimes with a severe or penetrating injury, the student might be experiencing seizures that occur. Right. And then emotional trauma is often common for students with brain injury. Kids often have PTSD related to the accident itself, or they have anxiety about becoming injured again. And they may be experiencing ongoing depression and anxiety related to the changes in their own functioning. So, and I talked about my grandfather, my experience with him, and that depression and anxiety was a significant factor for him, because he was very aware of the change in his function since he had that brain injury. So I'm not going to go into executive function difficulties in depth today. We have just 10 more minutes, but these are some of the domains that we consider when we're concerned about executive function difficulties. And we think about kids that you know, not just for kids with brain injury, but many students that we serve through special education struggle in some of these areas. So being able to inhibit their actions, shifting location, shifting ideas, emotional control, initiating tasks, working memory, that's the ability to hold information in your short-term memory in order to solve problems. So, you know, when I go to get something from another room, by the time I get there, My working memory often fails me, and I've forgotten what I was there for. Planning and organizing materials, monitoring lots of things, whether I'm meeting expectations, whether I'm completing tasks whether I'm staying with tasks to completion, etc. I have a little video. I'm not going to show it today, but if you want just a quick overview of what executive functions are, I've got a quick link to that you can follow up on later. All right, so now I'm going to talk about completing those first 4 columns of the functional assessment. So setting events, again, I mentioned earlier that people usually know what setting events are, even if they don't use that term. If you talk to the people that know the student, talk about how is the student when they come into the school environment. They will often refer to setting events. So things like the changes in the schedule. A student might come in anxious because they know that there's going to be an assembly that day, and even though that's not necessarily a direct antecedent, we know that they're going to carry that anxiety later in the day, and that may set them up for difficulties. If they're having side effects of medication, or their medical provider is trying to find the right match, that might be an impact. Or if they didn't take their medication that day, maybe they had a conflict, they had a fight with their friend earlier that day, and then later that day they're more likely to be irritable and be set off by antecedents. And then I brought back regulatory disturbances that can fall under setting events. So, the kiddo just didn't sleep last night. Mom drops him off, say, "I'm sorry, I know he's tired, but he was determined he was going to come to school," and then that sets him up for a rough day. Antecedents, I divide antecedents into 4 categories: task-related, environmental, social, and transition antecedents. And so I broke these down in slides. So examples of task-related antecedents. So if a student is experiencing executive function difficulties, they might have difficulty with tasks that require sustained attention. So I'm going to be looking for that when I do the routines analysis. It might be too hard. I don't know that it's very often it's too easy, but it's often too long, or the student doesn't know how to begin it, don't know what to do to end the task, and they have trouble turning in assignments, things like that. Environmental antecedents, here's some examples. It could be social settings. The environment could be too noisy or overstimulation. We want to watch for light levels. That's very common. Kids might be too sensitive to the level of light, or screen time, and we watch for the impact of screen time, things like that. Social antecedents, often kids with brain injuries struggle socially for a number of different reasons, and so we watch for those because that can have an impact on them. They're just struggling to make friends or sustain friendships, or they're realizing that the quality of friendships or the way that they were able to relate to other kids is different, and that's really stressful. It can be a trigger. And then transitioning from a preferred activity to a less preferred activity. So a student coming in from recess and then they don't enjoy, so there's very little motivation to transition from recess. Higher to low energy levels, so I watch for that. A lot of times kids have a difficult time regulating. So, we think that going out to recess helps them get the wiggles out, but often it puts them in a higher energy level, and then when they transition back into a more academic setting, they're still at that higher level and have a difficult time calming down. And it changes in amount of structure and changes in the level of supervision. All right, so I have about 5 more minutes, so I'm on the whirlwind path. So problem behaviors, when I get to that section, what I do is I prioritize problem behaviors. Sometimes when I ask the team to prioritize for me, I say, if you could change one thing, what would it be? What's really interesting is that sometimes they will prioritize differently than I would. So I had an incident where a teacher talked to me about a student who punched her, and she was really worried about that behavior, but when I asked her what her priority was, it was word completion. But I would really suggest that we prioritize those dangerous behaviors first, because that really is what will limit kids' ability to participate in the regular education program. And after that, I would say property disruption or destruction. Property disruption is things like maybe they dumped a box of books out on the floor, didn't damage the books. And then destruction is, they are starting to tear out pages and things like that. Personal space violations, so they're just not aware of physical space and they're bumping into kids, things like that, and getting into trouble that way. Verbal disrespect, it's a problem. Depends on how severe it is. If it's threats, that will be a higher level of priority. But if it's just surly tone of voice or saying, I don't want to, things like that. And then not participating in completing tasks, those are important, but those are a little bit lower priority. So I kind of turn this around. Actually, I'm going to switch to this slide. So I always look at, here's the concerning behavior, and then what would be the positive student behavior. I put those side by side, just to get us thinking about what our behavioral goals could be. Functions. So functions, again, this is not an in-depth course in functional assessment, but just a really quick reminder that usually there are two functions. Either the student's trying to get something, so it could be attention from adults or peers, sensory input, objects, or they're trying to escape something. It could be a less preferred task, a situation that's stressful, or uncomfortable emotions, or certain people that they don't like. All right, so here is, just really quickly in the last 3 minutes, I just will talk about putting this together. So this is my cat, Henry, who has reactive attachment disorder. And so I filled in the functional behavior assessment based on the problem behavior, him coming in the morning to snuggle with me while I'm eating breakfast, and he usually ends up biting my fingers. So I filled in all of the pieces. The setting event, this happens more often when I'm at work and he feels lonely. If his food dish is not completely full, that makes him mad in the morning. I try to sleep in, so I didn't when he thought I should. Those are antecedents. And then when I sit down on the couch, I eat my breakfast on the couch. Then he often bites me. The consequence, what happens after I yell at him to stop and put him in timeout, which is not effective for him. And then I think the function is to gain attention. So this is a routines analysis for him, and we are down to just 2 minutes, but you can look at this on your own time and just see kind of how that worked. And then I completed a competing pathways analysis for him, which is simply, what would be a replacement behavior? Just telling him to stop or punishing the behavior is not going to be effective. I need positive strategies. And he's just a cat, but it really does work. If he meows at me in a really cute voice and I pet him right away and give him lots of attention, it makes a huge difference. So essentially I'm teaching him, if he wants attention, the appropriate communication strategy is to meow, and then I pet him, and he gets the same consequence. He gets that attention in a positive way. So, this form, and this is one of the handouts that I had. I hand this into all of you. Once you have completed all those sections, you can see it just lines up neatly. You've talked about what the setting event is. When you're doing the plan with the team, you can right here put in what you think would be appropriate strategies for the student. The team can come together and talk about good antecedent strategies based on what we know so far about this kiddo. And by the way, in the form that you have, it says student name, not group by name. Teaching strategy, so what are we going to teach the student to help them learn some new behaviors that might help them during the day, and then what are we going to do after the behavior occurs. So, all right. So for the next slides, I have just some ideas for strategies that are specific to the student. I'm just going to back up here and just talk about the categories. So these are some strategies that you might consider for a student with brain injury to meet their physical needs. So this is just a helpful list as you're filling this out and looking for ideas. I've got quite a few on here. Communication needs. One of the things I really emphasize with teams working with anybody that has communication needs is to make sure that you allow processing time. And I have a link here to an activity where people can kind of simulate what it feels like to need processing time. And then executive function strategies. I linked to this activities guide that's available at the website for the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. There's lots of really good resources on executive function strategies. The nice thing about this activities guide is that it's organized by age group, and so you can print that out and share it with parents or teachers. So, all right, I think I managed to finish pretty much right on the dot. I'm going to see if there are any questions that I haven't answered. It doesn't look like there are. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. And my contact information is here. So if there's anything that I mentioned that you would like me to go into more depth, or some reference or tool that I didn't include, let me know, and I'm happy to share that with you. Feel free to email me.
So thank you so much, Cathy. If you have any questions, everybody, please go ahead and type them in the chat. If not, we'll end there, and we just want to remind you that on, I believe it's January 30th, we will be having a Facebook Live on function-based assessments with Ben Smith, also from Northwest Regional ESD. So all you have to do is log on to Facebook and go to Siebert Online to view that. And then if you're interested in any upcoming Siebert events, if you go to siebert.org and scroll down to the bottom, you can see all the upcoming webinars, all the upcoming Facebook Lives, and our in-person trainings. We will be having Perry Zirkle in April for a full-day training on TBI and legalities, and he'll be going through some case studies with us. It's going to be really interesting. So please sign up for any of those you would like to. And if you have any questions for Cathy that you don't want to type in or that come up later, please feel free to send emails to myself, Amanda, or Cathy. You should have gotten emails from Amanda. That might be the easiest. And we will make sure that you get the answers to your questions. On that note, I'm going to end the recording. Thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.